Hi, and welcome back to Section 3, Discovering Cycles Materials. In this section, we will be going over how cycles materials work, as well as how to use them. In the last section, we went over UV maps and how to unwrap a 3D object. Throughout this section, we will learn how to create a simple material with nodes, how to use texture transparency, how to create multi-channel materials using different texture maps, and then finally an introduction to physically based rendering. In this video, we will be going over creating a simple cycles material using nodes. We'll learn how to set up a simple material, how to navigate around the node editor, how to use texture coordinates, and then finally how to append a 3D model from a foreign file. In the last section, we created a UV map for this 3D model to project onto this 2D texture. If we now press Tab and go into edit mode, we can see our UV map is being displayed. In the last section, we also created a new material, except when we were creating it, we didn't understand what any of the fields meant. To have a better understanding of how materials work, we are going to go over here and change it to the node editor. After this, we are going to press N on the keyboard to remove the menu. I will then drag across to make this window bigger. After this, I'm going to press Tab and go back to object mode. If we now zoom in this window by scrolling up, you can see that we have three different nodes. We have a material output, a diffuse shader, and an image texture. However, we still don't know how any of this works. So I'm going to select all of them by pressing A twice, and then pressing X to delete. We now have a blank material. Under the surface, we have no output node, under the volume we have no output node, and under displacement we have no output node. To begin creating a material, we need one output node. To add this, we can go down here, or we can press Shift A. I will then go to Output and select Material Output. We now have a material output for the surface, volume, and displacement. The next thing we need is a shader to determine how our object looks. To do this, I'm also going to press Shift A, except this time we'll go down to Shaders, and under here we'll choose Diffuse. This diffuse shader is similar to a diffuse map, and is used to project color. The next thing we will do is connect the output to the surface. Now we can see that in the preview we have a new material that is completely white. To change how this material looks, we can change the color here. In this case, I'm going to change it to green. Now you'll notice that the color in here has changed to green. We can do this again by changing the color to any other color in here. Notice how whenever we change the color is also changing in the preview. However, it is not changing in the 3D viewport. The color is only visible when we render the image. The next thing we want to do is add an image to our material. To do this, I'm going to press Shift A, and this time we are going to go to Textures, and under here we are going to select Image Texture. This node is used to add an image to our material. Here I'm going to select the color output and connect it to the color of the diffuse shader. Now the color of our image texture is being fed through the color output into the color of the diffuse shader. The output of the diffuse shader is then being plugged into the surface of our material. After this, I'm going to go over here and select the image icon and then choose Tree Bark. Once we have selected this, you can see that we now have a texture applied to our mesh. The next thing we are going to learn about is image coordinates. Here you can see that on the input of the image we have a vector. This determines how our image looks and is projected onto the object. Here I'm going to press Shift A, and this time we are going to go to Input and then go down to Texture Coordinate. Once we have selected this, we can move over here. I'm now going to scroll out. Here we can see that if we rearrange our nodes, we now have 4 different nodes. And this one here allows us to determine which vector we want to use to project our image. By default in cycles, the UV option is always connected, even if we can't see it. To connect a node, we can simply drag from one point to another. To get rid of a node, we can hold down the Control key and then drag across it. Here we can see we have a few options for our vector. Notice that all of the vectors are the same color, so that they can be connected together. Here we can see if I connect reflection, that my texture is being reflected from the mesh. By using these coordinates, we can make our textures and shaders look better and have more flexibility. In this case, if I use any of the other vectors that aren't UV, I don't need a UV map. So in this case, if I want to, I can just use generated and I don't need to unwrap this object. However, here you can see that generated doesn't always look so great. And the best case is always to use UV as you have the most control. Another way of doing the same thing is to press Shift A and under Input we can go to UV Map. This will add a UV Map node, and from this we can select our UV map. If we select our object and then go over into the mesh properties, you can see that here we have one UV map. It is possible to add additional UV maps. However, in our case, we only need one UV map to project the texture. In this case, if we select UV, it will select the first option by default. Otherwise, if we have more than one, we can use this node here and then plug the UV into the vector. The next thing I'm going to do is delete the texture coordinate node by pressing X. I will then move the UV map up here. The last thing we are going to do is import a new 3D model from a different blend file. To do this, I'm going to go to File and choose Append. Here you can see we also have an import option. If you know that the model you have is a blend file, then you can use the Append option. However, otherwise you will need to use the import option to import the appropriate file. In this case, we will use Append. I have now selected the appropriate directory where my file exists. Here we can see I have a flower.blend file which I wish to append my 3D model from. To do this, I'm going to select it and then go down to Object. After this, I'm going to select the flower object. I will then click Append from Library. Once we've done this, you can see we have a new flower object added to our scene. If you wish to also use this 3D model, there will be a download link below the video. Now what I'm going to do is press A to deselect my model. I will then right-click to select it. Now I can access all the different properties of my model. After this, I'm going to close the node editor. To do this, we are going to hover in the top right-hand corner and then drag across until we see an arrow sign. After this, we will select and our two windows will merge together. The last thing I'll do is press S to scale and scale down my object. I will then press GX and GZ to move my object to the appropriate location. Again, I'm going to scale it down a bit more. Once I'm happy with the location of my object, I'm then going to press RX to rotate it on the X-axis and RY. The last thing we'll do is press Ctrl S and save. Now that we know how to create simple cycles materials,